Velociraptor pack defends wounded human. What happens next will amaze you. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing blurry patches of green and gold light streaming through a dense canopy above him. His head throbbed, a sharp pain pulsing at his temple as he tried to lift it from the ground. The earthy smell of damp soil filled his nostrils, and the faint rustling of leaves teased at the edges of his consciousness. Slowly, he became aware of the cold, sticky sensation spreading across his side. Blood. He didn't know how much, but it was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through his aching body. Disoriented, he shifted slightly, trying to assess his surroundings, when the unmistakable sound of low, guttural growls reached his ears. His breath hitched. Something was nearby, something large. His eyes darted around, and then he saw them. A pack of velociraptors stood a mere 10 feet away, their sleek bodies shimmering faintly in the dappled light. Their golden eyes bore into him with unsettling intensity, pupils narrowing into dark slits. One of them, slightly larger and with distinctive scars running along its snout, stood at the forefront. It held its head low, nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. The others fanned out behind it, tails swishing rhythmically like metronomes. The man froze, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay still. These were predators, swift, intelligent, and ruthlessly efficient hunters. He had studied their fossils, read countless papers hypothesizing about their behavior, but none of that prepared him for this moment. He could feel their primal energy radiating through the clearing, each movement deliberate, each growl vibrating in his chest. His hand instinctively pressed against the wound on his side, trying to stifle the pain and slow the bleeding. The motion caught the attention of one of the raptors, a younger one, judging by its slightly smaller size and unblemished hide. It tilted its head, its eyes flickering with curiosity rather than malice. The man's heart pounded in his chest, loud enough that he feared it might provoke them. The alpha raptor, the one with the scars, let out a soft, throaty sound, almost like a command. The rest of the pack stilled instantly, their golden eyes locked onto the man. He braced himself, every muscle tensing for the inevitable. Would they pounce? Tear him apart? He had seen documentaries of lions hunting gazelles, their precision and savagery strikingly beautiful in their brutality. But this felt different. There was an intelligence in their eyes, a calculating awareness that went far beyond instinct. The alpha took a cautious step forward, its claws clicking softly against the forest floor. The man's breath caught. It lowered its head, sniffing the air again, before letting out a huff. The gesture was almost dismissive, as though it had made a decision. It stepped back, retreating slightly, and turned its head toward the rest of the pack. Another low growl rumbled from its throat, and the pack responded by backing off a few paces, their predatory tension easing. Confusion mingled with the man's fear. Why weren't they attacking? He didn't dare move yet, unsure if this was some form of raptor strategy or if they truly meant him no harm. The younger raptor, the curious one, took a step closer. Its snout twitched as it studied him, almost like it was trying to understand what he was. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the ground for support, and the movement caused the raptor to jerk its head back. The sudden motion seemed to remind the pack of his vulnerability, and they tensed again, their claws digging into the dirt. The alpha emitted another sharp growl, silencing them. It stepped forward once more, this time stopping just a few feet from the man. Its gaze bore into him, unblinking, as if it were weighing its options. The man's throat was dry. What do you want?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. He wasn't expecting an answer, of course, but the absurdity of his situation demanded some kind of outlet for his spiraling thoughts. The alpha tilted its head at the sound of his voice. For a moment he thought he saw something, curiosity maybe, in its golden eyes. Then it did something that left him utterly speechless. It sat down. The rest of the pack hesitated, glancing between their leader and the human, before cautiously following suit. One by one, The velociraptors lowered themselves to the ground, their postures relaxed yet alert. It was as if they were waiting. The man's mind raced, struggling to make sense of this. Raptors were supposed to be ruthless killers, weren't they? Yet here they were, watching him with an almost eerie patience. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. He shifted slightly, testing their reaction, and they didn't move. The alpha's eyes followed him closely, but its body remained still. He decided to take the chance to inspect his wound. Pulling his hand away, he winced at the sight of dark crimson staining his shirt. It wasn't as bad as he feared, but it still wasn't good. He needed to stop the bleeding, but he had no supplies, no way to treat himself. The thought of moving, of trying to leave the clearing, felt impossible with the raptors watching his every move. The alpha let out a soft chuff, almost like a sigh, and stood. The rest of the pack mirrored its movement, rising to their feet in near-perfect unison. The man tensed, expecting the worst, but instead of attacking, the alpha turned and began walking away. Paused after a few steps, looking back over its shoulder. The younger raptor made a soft chirping noise and followed, while the others hung back, their eyes still on the man. Were they leaving him? He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or abandoned. But then the alpha stopped again, turning fully to face him. It emitted a short, sharp bark and tilted its head in what could only be described as an expectant gesture. The man frowned. Was it waiting for him? His breath came in short bursts as he considered the situation. Following a pack of velociraptors was, by any measure, a terrible idea. Yet staying here, bleeding and defenseless, wasn't exactly a winning strategy either. He felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe? As he pushed himself up into a sitting position, the effort sent a wave of dizziness crashing over him, and he swayed, gripping the ground for support. The alpha raptor watched him closely, its tail swishing with quiet impatience. The man took a deep breath, summoning whatever strength he had left, and staggered to his feet. Pain shot through his side, but he gritted his teeth and steadied himself. He wasn't sure why he was trusting them, why he was putting his life in the claws of creatures that could end him in an instant, but something about their behavior, their strange, almost protective demeanor, compelled him to follow. As he took his first hesitant step toward the alpha, the younger raptor chirped again, a sound that almost seemed encouraging. The rest of the pack parted slightly, creating a clear path for him to join them. He stumbled forward, his legs shaky but determined. The alpha raptor waited until he was a few feet away before turning and continuing into the forest, leading him deeper into the unknown. The rest of the pack closed in around him, their sleek bodies forming a protective circle. The man couldn't help but wonder if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if this unlikely alliance might be the key to his survival. The forest grew denser as they moved deeper, the trees forming a thick canopy overhead that cast the world in hues of green and gold. The man stumbled along, his movements awkward and uneven as he fought to keep pace with the raptors. Each step sent sharp stabs of pain radiating from his wounded side, but he clenched his teeth and pushed through. He couldn't afford to falter, not when this strange pack of predators seemed to have decided to tolerate his presence, if not protect him outright. The alpha raptor led the way, its movements fluid and purposeful. Its scarred snout swung side to side as it scanned the terrain, its powerful legs carrying it over roots and rocks with ease. Behind it, the younger raptor occasionally glanced back at the man, its golden eyes filled with an unsettling mix of curiosity and wariness. The rest of the pack fanned out around them, their sleek bodies forming an almost impenetrable ring of protection. The man couldn't shake the feeling of being herded, as though he were some wayward member of their group. But what truly baffled him was the absence of aggression. Velociraptors were supposed to be relentless hunters, creatures that would rip into prey without hesitation. Yet these raptors moved with a sense of control, their actions deliberate and almost calculated. He caught sight of the younger raptor again. It chirped softly, the sound almost playful, before bounding ahead to join the alpha. The two exchanged a series of clicks and low growls that sounded suspiciously like communication. The man shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't just instinct at work. This was something far more complex. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp snap of a twig underfoot. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness of the forest, and he froze instinctively. The raptors halted as one, their heads swiveling toward him in perfect unison. The alpha's golden eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the man felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force. His breath caught, the air heavy with unspoken tension. "I'm okay," he whispered hoarsely, not even sure why he was talking to them. The words felt ridiculous, but he needed to fill the silence, to convince himself that this wasn't some fever dream brought on by blood loss. The alpha tilted its head slightly, as though it understood. Then it huffed softly and resumed walking, the rest of the pack following its lead. The man let out a shaky breath and forced himself to move again, his legs trembling with the effort. The path ahead grew steeper, the terrain marked by jagged rocks and thick underbrush. The man's boots scraped against the uneven ground, his body protesting every step. Sweat dripped down his brow, mixing with the dried blood on his face. He felt like he was walking in a trance, his mind unable to focus on anything but the need to keep moving. And then, without warning, the alpha stopped. The rest of the pack froze instantly, their bodies tense and alert. The man stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He followed the alpha's gaze and saw it, a dark shape moving through the trees ahead. His heart lurched. It was bigger than the raptors, with a hulking frame and a lumbering gait that sent vibrations through the ground. The man's blood ran cold as the creature stepped into the dappled light, revealing a massive predator covered in dark, mottled scales. Its powerful jaws parted in a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the forest. A Carnotaurus. The raptors reacted instantly. The alpha let out a sharp bark, and the pack spread out, their bodies low to the ground as they formed a defensive line. The man felt a surge of panic. The Carnotaurus was easily twice their size, its muscular frame built for brute force. He had no doubt it could tear through the pack and him with little effort. The alpha raptor stepped forward, its scarred snout raised defiantly. It emitted a series of growls and clicks, its tail lashing behind it. The Carnotaurus hesitated, its tiny arms twitching as it regarded the smaller predator. The standoff was brief but electrifying, the air charged with the promise of violence. Then the Carnotaurus roared, a deafening sound that made the man's ears ring. It lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping inches away from the alpha. The raptors scattered, their movements precise and coordinated as they flanked the larger predator. The man watched in stunned silence as the pack moved like a well-oiled machine, their tactics eerily reminiscent of a military unit. The alpha darted in, slashing at the Carnotaurus's leg before retreating just out of reach. The younger raptor followed suit, its claws raking across the predator's thick hide. The Carnotaurus roared in frustration, its massive tail swinging in a wide arc that narrowly missed the smaller creatures. The man's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. He was rooted to the spot, his mind torn between awe and terror. He had never seen anything like this, a display of strategy and teamwork that defied everything he thought he knew about these creatures. And then he saw it. One of the raptors, a smaller, more timid member of the pack, was caught in the Carnotaurus's sights. The larger predator charged, its massive jaws snapping shut around the raptor's leg. A pained screech filled the air as the raptor was lifted off the ground, its body thrashing wildly. The alpha's reaction was immediate. It let out a piercing cry and launched itself at the Carnotaurus, its claws raking across the predator's face. The Carnotaurus bellowed in pain, dropping the injured raptor as it swung its head violently. The alpha landed gracefully, its body coiled like a spring as it prepared to strike again. The injured raptor limped away, its movements slow and unsteady. The man's heart ached at the sight. Despite their ferocity, these creatures were clearly capable of loyalty and sacrifice. The alpha's determination to protect its pack was undeniable, and for a fleeting moment, the man felt a strange sense of kinship with them. The battle raged on, the forest alive with the sounds of snarls and roars. The raptors were relentless, their attacks swift and precise. But the Carnotaurus was a formidable opponent. Blood stained the ground, a gruesome reminder of the stakes. And then, as if on cue, the Alpha let out a sharp, commanding cry. The pack responded instantly, breaking away from the Carnotaurus and retreating into the underbrush. The Alpha was the last to leave, its golden eyes locking onto the man one final time before disappearing into the trees. The Carnotaurus stood alone in the clearing, its massive chest heaving as it surveyed its surroundings. It seemed disoriented, its eyes darting between the trees. With a frustrated snarl, it turned and lumbered away, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. The man collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The raptors had saved him. They had faced down a creature far larger and more dangerous than themselves, and they had done it for him, for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. As he sat there, the forest slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The distant calls of birds and the rustle of leaves filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments ago. The man closed his eyes, his mind racing with questions. Why had they protected him? What had driven them to risk their lives for a human? A soft chirp broke the silence, and he opened his eyes to see the younger raptor peering at him from the edge of the clearing. Its golden eyes were curious, almost gentle, as it tilted its head. The Alpha appeared moments later, its presence commanding as it stepped forward. The man's chest tightened. He didn't know what this meant, but one thing was clear. The pack wasn't done with him yet. The Alpha raptor moved back into the clearing, its golden eyes fixed on the man as it let out a low growl. The sound wasn't threatening. It was almost as if it were beckoning him. The younger raptor chirped softly, its tail swaying in a slow rhythm. The pack had returned, surrounding him once more, their movements deliberate yet calm. The man stared at them, his mind reeling. He had witnessed their intelligence, their teamwork, and even their capacity for what could only be described as loyalty. But what did they want from him now? His body ached, his wounds throbbed, and his energy was nearly gone. But the pull of the pack was undeniable. It was as though he had become a part of something larger, an unspoken connection that transcended species. With a deep breath, he pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily against a nearby tree for support. The Alpha raptor observed him closely, its nostrils flaring as it seemed to assess his condition. Once he was steady, the Alpha turned and began to move, its scarred body cutting through the underbrush with practiced ease. The rest of the pack followed suit, their sleek forms blending seamlessly into the forest. The man hesitated for only a moment before stumbling after them. Each step sent a sharp jolt of pain through his side, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. The pack had saved him from the Carnotaurus, and now they seemed to be leading him somewhere. He didn't know why, but he felt an odd sense of trust in their guidance. The forest grew darker as they ventured deeper, the canopy above thickening to block out much of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. The man's boots slipped on the uneven terrain, and more than once, he had to catch himself on a low-hanging branch to avoid falling. The raptors moved with an effortless grace, their claws silent against the ground as they navigated the dense foliage. The Alpha paused suddenly, its body tensing as it sniffed the air. The rest of the pack froze, their heads swiveling in unison to scan their surroundings. The man stopped too, his breath catching as he sensed their unease. His eyes darted around the forest, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, without warning, the Alpha let out a sharp bark, and the pack sprang into action. They surrounded the man in a tight circle, their bodies low to the ground and their eyes trained on something just beyond the trees. The man's heart pounded as he clutched his side, his mind racing with the possibilities. Was it another predator? Had the Carnotaurus returned? A rustling sound came from the underbrush, followed by the snap of a twig. The man's eyes widened as a figure emerged. A small, agile creature covered in feathers, its sharp beak clicking nervously. A Deinonychus. It wasn't as large as the Carnotaurus, but its lean, muscular frame and razor-sharp claws made it no less dangerous. The pack didn't move, Their golden eyes locked onto the newcomer as it crept closer. The Deinonychus let out a shrill screech, its feathers ruffling as it tried to assert dominance. The alpha raptor responded with a deep, rumbling growl, its body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The man backed up slowly, his hand gripping the trunk of a tree for support. He could feel the tension in the air, a charged stillness that threatened to explode into chaos at any moment. The alpha took a step forward, its tail lashing as it issued a warning. The Deinonychus hesitated, its beady eyes flicking between the pack and the man. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent. Then the Deinonychus made its move. It lunged forward with startling speed, its claws outstretched and its jaws snapping. The alpha met the attack head-on, its powerful legs propelling it into the air as it collided with the smaller predator. The impact sent both creatures tumbling to the ground, a flurry of feathers and scales. The rest of the pack erupted into action. The younger raptor darted forward, its claws slashing at the Deinonychus's flank, while another raptor lunged for its throat. The man pressed himself against the tree, his breathing shallow as he watched the fierce battle unfold. The Deinonychus fought with wild desperation, its movements erratic and unpredictable, but it was no match for the coordinated assault of the pack. Within moments, the fight was over. The Deinonychus lay motionless on the ground, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths before it stilled completely. The alpha raptor stood over the fallen creature, its scarred snout glistening with blood as it let out a triumphant roar. The sound echoed through the forest, a primal declaration of victory that sent a shiver down the man's spine. The pack gathered around their leader, their bodies brushing against one another as they emitted soft, guttural sounds. It was a moment of unity, a display of their bond as a family. The man watched in awe, his fear gradually giving way to admiration. These creatures were far more than the mindless killers he had imagined. They were intelligent, loyal, and deeply connected to one another. The alpha turned its attention back to the man, its golden eyes narrowing as it approached. The man's pulse quickened as he braced himself, unsure of what to expect. But the alpha stopped just short of him, its head tilting slightly as if in consideration. Then, to his astonishment, it lowered its scarred snout and nudged his hand gently. The gesture was so unexpected, so disarming, that the man let out a shaky laugh. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the raptor's rough skin. The alpha didn't flinch. It simply stood there, its golden eyes watching him with an intensity that was almost human. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know if the raptor understood the words, but in that moment it didn't matter. The connection between them was undeniable, a silent understanding that transcended language. The alpha let out a low, rumbling sound and stepped back, its gaze lingering on the man before it turned and began to move again. The rest of the pack followed, their bodies weaving through the trees like shadows. The man took a deep breath and forced himself to follow, his legs trembling but determined. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest changing around them as they ventured deeper into its heart. The man's exhaustion was becoming unbearable, his wounds throbbing with every step. But just as he thought he couldn't go any farther, the alpha stopped abruptly, its head lifting to sniff the air. The pack fanned out, their movements cautious as they approached a clearing ahead. The man squinted, his vision blurred by fatigue, but as they stepped into the open space, he froze. Before him was a hidden sanctuary, a place untouched by time. Towering trees surrounded a crystal-clear pond, their roots twisting into the water like ancient fingers. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers, and the soft hum of insects filled the silence. It was beautiful, almost otherworldly, and the man felt a surge of relief wash over him. The alpha turned to him, its golden eyes gleaming as it let out a soft growl. It nudged him gently, guiding him toward the edge of the pond. The man collapsed onto the soft grass, his body shaking with exhaustion. He dipped his hands into the cool water, letting it soothe his aching wounds as he took deep, steadying breaths. The pack settled around him, their bodies relaxed as they drank from the pond and groomed one another. The man watched them with a mix of gratitude and awe. He had stumbled into their world by accident, an intruder in their domain. Yet they had accepted him, protected him, and now they were offering him a moment of peace. As he lay back against the grass, his eyes drifting shut, he felt the weight of their presence around him. For the first time since his ordeal began, he allowed himself to feel safe. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was content to exist in this fragile, beautiful moment, surrounded by creatures who had shown him the true meaning of trust and survival. The man awoke to the soft sound of rustling leaves and the gentle chirps of birds in the trees above. His body ached, his muscles stiff from exhaustion and the toll of his injuries, but for the first time in what felt like days, he didn't feel the oppressive weight of fear. Slowly, he opened his eyes, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy blinding him momentarily. He glanced around, realizing the raptors were still there. The alpha lay a short distance away, its scarred head resting on its forelimbs, its golden eyes half closed. The rest of the pack lounged nearby, some grooming one another while others seemed to stand watch. It was a strange, almost serene scene, and the man couldn't help but marvel at how different these creatures were from the terrifying images he had always associated with them. With a groan, he pushed himself upright, his movements slow and deliberate. The alpha's head lifted instantly, its eyes narrowing as it regarded him. For a moment, they stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. Then, as though satisfied, the alpha relaxed again, letting out a soft huff. The man took this as permission to move. He crawled toward the pond, the cool grass soft against his hands and knees. His reflection stared back at him from the still water, and he winced at the sight. His face was pale and streaked with dirt, his shirt torn and stained with blood. He looked like a man who had barely survived an encounter with death, which, in truth, he was. Cupping his hands, he drank deeply, the cold water soothing his parched throat. He splashed his face, the sensation refreshing but also painful as it stung the cuts and scrapes on his skin. For a while, he simply sat there, letting the sounds of the forest wash over him. The younger raptor approached, its movements cautious but curious. It tilted its head as it watched him, its golden eyes filled with a kind of innocent wonder. The man smiled faintly, raising his hand in a slow, non-threatening gesture. To his surprise, the raptor stepped closer, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. "Hey there," the man murmured, his voice soft and soothing. "You're not so scary up close, are you?" The raptor chirped in response, a high-pitched, almost playful sound. It lowered its head, and for a moment, the man thought it might allow him to touch it. But then a sharp growl from the alpha made it stop. The younger raptor backed away reluctantly, its gaze flickering between the man and its leader. The alpha stood, its imposing form casting a shadow over the man. It let out another low growl, this one directed at him. The message was clear: don't get too comfortable. The man nodded, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. He understood. The pack had accepted him, but trust was a fragile thing, and the alpha wasn't about to let its guard down completely. The pack began to stir, their movements purposeful as they gathered near the edge of the clearing. The alpha barked sharply, and the raptors responded immediately, forming a loose formation. The man frowned, watching as they moved with a sense of urgency. Something was happening. The alpha turned to him, its golden eyes locking onto his. It tilted its head toward the trees, emitting a low, rumbling sound. The man hesitated, unsure of what it wanted. Then it repeated the gesture, this time more forcefully. The message was clear: follow. With a sigh, the man pushed himself to his feet, wincing as pain shot through his side. He took a deep breath and began to follow the pack, his steps slow and unsteady. The raptors moved through the forest with fluid grace, their bodies weaving through the dense foliage as though it were second nature. The man stumbled after them, doing his best to keep up. As they moved, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The chirping of birds faded, and even the rustling of leaves seemed muted. The man's unease grew with each step, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. He glanced at the raptors, noting their tense postures and the way their heads swung from side to side, scanning their surroundings. The alpha suddenly stopped, its body rigid as it sniffed the air. The rest of the pack froze, their golden eyes narrowing as they followed their leader's lead. The man halted as well, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know what they had sensed, but the air was thick with tension. Then he heard it, a distant sound, faint but distinct. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like the pounding of heavy machinery. The man frowned, his mind racing. What could it be? A vehicle? Construction equipment? The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of voices. The raptors tensed, their bodies coiling like springs as they prepared for something. The alpha let out a sharp growl, and the pack shifted into formation, their movements synchronized and precise. The man felt a pang of fear. Whatever was coming, the raptors were ready to fight. The source of the noise came into view moments later. Through the trees, the man caught glimpses of metal and movement. His eyes widened as he realized what he was seeing. A group of men, heavily armed and dressed in tactical gear, accompanied by a large, rumbling vehicle. Poachers. The man's stomach dropped. He had heard stories about operations like this, illegal groups that hunted rare animals for profit, often leaving destruction in their wake. But what were they doing here? This area was supposed to be off-limits, protected. The poachers moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons held at the ready as they scanned the forest. The vehicle, a heavily modified truck with a mounted cage, rolled to a stop, its engine rumbling ominously. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, barked orders to the others. The man's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at the raptors, their sleek bodies blending almost perfectly with the shadows of the trees. The alpha was completely still, its golden eyes locked onto the poachers. It seemed to be waiting, calculating. The man's mind raced. What could he do? He was unarmed, injured, and completely outnumbered. The raptors were formidable, but even they might not stand a chance against the poachers' weapons. And yet, he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The poachers spread out, their movements methodical as they searched the area. One of them approached the tree line, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was close, too close. The man's breath caught as the alpha shifted slightly, its muscles coiled like a spring. Before he could react, the alpha struck. It lunged from the shadows with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air as it collided with the poacher. The man let out a choked scream as he was thrown to the ground, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. The pack erupted into action, their movements a blur as they attacked with calculated precision. The poachers shouted in alarm, their weapons firing wildly as they tried to fend off the raptors. The man dropped to the ground, his hands covering his head as chaos erupted around him. Despite the gunfire, the raptors fought with ferocity and intelligence, their teamwork impeccable. The alpha led the charge, its scarred form a blur as it darted between the poachers, striking with lethal efficiency. The younger raptor followed close behind, its chirps almost sounding like commands as it coordinated with the others. The man risked a glance, his heart pounding as he watched the battle unfold. The poachers were struggling, their weapons useless against the speed and agility of the pack. But the raptors weren't invincible. One of them let out a pained screech as a bullet grazed its flank, and the man felt a surge of anger. He didn't know where the strength came from, but he found himself moving, crawling toward the fallen poacher's rifle. His fingers closed around the weapon, its weight unfamiliar and intimidating in his hands. He forced himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. The poachers were too focused on the raptors to notice him. He raised the rifle, his hands trembling as he took aim. He had never fired a gun before, but desperation drove him. He squeezed the trigger, the sound of the shot echoing through the forest. The bullet struck the truck's engine, a loud bang followed by a plume of smoke. The vehicle sputtered and died, its power cut. The poachers turned toward the sound, their faces twisted in confusion and fear. The raptors seized the distraction, their attacks growing even more aggressive. The man fired again, this time at the ground near the poacher's feet. They shouted in panic, their formation breaking as they scrambled for cover. The alpha let out a triumphant roar, its golden eyes locking onto the man. For the first time, he felt like they truly understood each other. They were fighting for survival together. The man's hands trembled as he held the rifle, its weight alien and intimidating in his grasp. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, fueling his resolve as the chaos unfolded around him. The raptors moved like shadows, their sleek bodies darting in and out of view as they systematically disarmed the poacher's advantage. The alpha raptor was relentless, its scarred body a blur of motion as it attacked with a calculated precision that seemed almost tactical. The poachers scrambled, their shouts blending with the growls and screeches of the raptors. One of them turned, his weapon raised, but before he could fire, the younger raptor leaped from the underbrush, knocking him to the ground. The man winced as he saw the poacher's rifle fall uselessly to the forest floor, his shouts of pain quickly silenced as the raptors asserted their dominance. The alpha raptor barked sharply, its golden eyes locking onto the poacher's leader, a tall man with a scar running down his face. He was barking orders, trying desperately to regain control of his crew, but it was clear the tide had turned. The alpha advanced toward him, its movements deliberate and menacing. The man watched, his grip tightening on the rifle as he debated what to do next. He wasn't a fighter. He had never been in a situation like this before, but he couldn't stand idly by while the raptors, who had saved him, fought for their lives. He forced himself to take a step forward, his legs trembling beneath him. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. He raised the rifle, pointing it at the poachers. "Leave now, or you won't make it out of this forest." The leader turned toward him, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You think you can scare us off? This forest isn't yours." "It's not yours either," the man shot back, his voice growing steadier. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." The leader hesitated, his gaze flicking to the alpha raptor, which was now just a few feet away. The predator let out a low, rumbling growl, its muscles coiled like a spring. The tension in the air was palpable, the forest holding its breath as the standoff continued. One of the poachers suddenly bolted, dropping his weapon as he ran. Another followed, his face pale with fear. The leader cursed under his breath, his confidence faltering as he realized he was losing control. The man took a step closer, his rifle still raised. "Go," he said, his voice steady now. "Take your men and go. You don't want to push your luck." The leader glared at him, his jaw clenched, but he seemed to sense the futility of the situation. With a frustrated growl, he threw his weapon to the ground. "Fine," he spat, "but this isn't over. You're going to regret this." He turned and retreated, his remaining men following closely behind. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving the clearing eerily silent. The man let out a shaky breath, lowering the rifle as the tension began to dissipate. The alpha raptor stepped forward, its golden eyes fixed on the man. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. Then, to his astonishment, the raptor lowered its head slightly, a gesture that felt almost like a nod of acknowledgement. The younger raptor chirped softly, its tail swaying as it approached the man. It tilted its head, its golden eyes filled with curiosity and something else, something that felt like gratitude. The man smiled faintly, lowering himself to one knee as he extended a hand. The raptor hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, its snout brushing against his fingers. "You're amazing," the man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of you." The pack began to relax, their bodies losing the tension that had carried them through the battle. They moved closer to the man, their movements cautious but unthreatening. The alpha remained at a slight distance, its gaze watchful but no longer hostile. The man sat back, his body aching from the effort but his heart filled with an overwhelming sense of awe. He had never imagined he would witness something like this, let alone be a part of it. These creatures, so often painted as mindless killers, had shown him a level of intelligence, loyalty, and courage that he would have thought impossible. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion hit him like a wave. His limbs felt heavy, and his vision blurred at the edges. He leaned against a tree, his breathing shallow as his body demanded rest. The alpha stepped closer, its golden eyes narrowing as it seemed to assess his condition. The younger raptor chirped again, nudging his arm gently with its snout. The man smiled faintly, his eyelids growing heavy. "I'm okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "Just tired." The alpha let out a low growl, its head turning toward the forest as if sensing something. The pack began to move, their sleek bodies weaving through the underbrush with practiced ease. The younger raptor stayed by his side, its presence oddly comforting as he drifted in and out of consciousness. When he awoke, the forest was bathed in the soft light of dawn. The raptors were still there, their forms blending seamlessly with the shadows of the trees. The alpha stood at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on something in the distance. The man pushed himself upright, his body protesting with every movement. He followed the alpha's gaze and saw it. A narrow path winding through the trees, the faint outline of a structure visible in the distance. His heart leapt. Could it be a ranger station? A research outpost? Hope surged within him as he realized he might finally have a chance to find help. The alpha turned to him, its golden eyes meeting his. It let out a soft growl, nudging him gently with its snout. The message was clear: go. The pack began to move, their bodies blending into the forest as they disappeared one by one. The younger raptor lingered for a moment, its gaze lingering on the man before it followed the others. The man watched them go, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't know if he would ever see them again, but he knew he would never forget what they had done for him. They had saved his life, protected him when he was at his most vulnerable, and shown him a world he had never imagined. With a deep breath, he turned toward the path and began to walk. His steps were slow, his body aching with each movement, but his heart was filled with a newfound sense of purpose. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was determined to make it. If not for himself, then for the creatures who had given him a second chance. As he moved through the forest, the sounds of nature surrounded him. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of unseen animals. It was a symphony of life, a reminder of the beauty and resilience of the natural world. And for the first time in days, the man allowed himself to hope. The man's steps were slow and uneven as he made his way down the narrow path, every muscle in his body protesting against the effort. The wound in his side throbbed, a dull ache that refused to be ignored, but he pushed through the pain. He didn't have much choice. Whatever lay ahead, whether it was salvation or another trial, he had to keep moving. The forest around him began to shift, the dense undergrowth giving way to more open terrain. The trees were sparser here, their branches twisting high above him, allowing shafts of golden sunlight to pierce through the canopy. He could feel the warmth on his skin, a welcome reprieve from the cold, damp shadows of the deeper woods. In the distance, the structure he had glimpsed earlier grew clearer. It was small and weathered, its wooden beams streaked with moss and age, but it was unmistakably man-made. A ranger station. Relief flooded through him, and for the first time in what felt like days, he allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive this. But as he drew closer, his steps faltered. The station wasn't abandoned as he had feared. It was occupied. A faint plume of smoke rose from a makeshift fire pit outside, and voices carried on the wind, low and indistinct but undeniably human. His heart sank as he recognized the familiar rumble of the poachers' leader. They had regrouped here. He crouched low, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to stay out of sight. His mind raced. What could he do? He was unarmed now, having left the rifle behind in the clearing, and he was in no condition to fight. But turning back wasn't an option. He needed supplies, water, food, and some way to treat his injuries, or he wouldn't last much longer. Peering through the underbrush, he counted 3 men, their weapons slung lazily over their shoulders as they talked and gestured toward the station. The leader stood at the center, his scarred face twisted into a scowl as he barked orders. The truck they had used earlier was parked nearby, its engine silent but still reeking of oil and gasoline. The man's gaze shifted to the station itself. The door was slightly ajar, revealing shelves lined with supplies, first aid kits, canned food, and a radio. If he could just make it inside without being seen, he might stand a chance. But then, just as he was about to move, he heard it, a soft rustle behind him. He froze, his heart pounding as he turned his head ever so slightly. The younger raptor stood there, its golden eyes wide and unblinking as it watched him. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with silent understanding. The raptor tilted its head, emitting a soft chirp that made his heart clench. It was as though it was asking him what the plan was, waiting for his lead. The man swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't know why the raptor had returned, but he wasn't about to question it. Not now. You shouldn't be here, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's too dangerous. The raptor chirped again, its tail swishing as it stepped closer. Its movements were cautious but purposeful, its gaze flickering between him and the poachers in the distance. It was waiting for him to act. The man let out a shaky breath, his fingers curling into fists as he made a decision. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. The poachers had invaded the forest, threatened its creatures, and now stood between him and survival. He couldn't let them win. Slowly, he crept forward, the raptor following close behind. The underbrush provided some cover, but his heart hammered in his chest as he closed the distance to the station. He could hear the poachers' voices more clearly now, their conversation laced with frustration and anger. "Can't believe we lost that damn pack," one of them muttered, his voice low and gruff. "Do you know how much they'd fetch on the market?" The leader growled in response. "Doesn't matter. We'll track them down soon enough. They can't have gone far." The man clenched his jaw, anger boiling in his chest. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the area for anything he could use as a weapon. A large branch lay nearby, its gnarled surface rough but sturdy. He reached for it, his fingers wrapping tightly around the wood as he prepared himself. The younger raptor seemed to sense his determination. It let out a soft growl, its sleek body tensing as it crouched beside him. Together, they were a strange but united pair. A wounded human and a predator bound by an unspoken alliance. The man waited until the poachers' backs were turned before making his move. He darted out from the underbrush, his footsteps silent against the forest floor. The raptor followed, its movements a blur as it flanked him. They reached the station door just as one of the poachers turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Hey!" the poacher shouted, reaching for his weapon. But before he could act, the raptor lunged, its claws slicing through the air with terrifying precision. The man didn't stop to watch. He shoved the door open and stumbled inside, his eyes scanning the shelves for the supplies he needed. His hands closed around a first aid kit, its bright red casing a beacon of hope. He grabbed it and a canteen of water, shoving them into a worn canvas bag he found hanging from a hook. The shouts and growls outside grew louder, the sounds of the battle filling the air. He turned back to the door, his heart racing as he prepared to leave. But just as he stepped outside, he saw the leader raise his rifle, its barrel aimed directly at the younger raptor. Time seemed to slow, the scene unfolding in agonizing clarity. The man didn't think, he acted. He raised the branch in his hands and swung it with all his strength, the wood connecting with the rifle just as the leader pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, the bullet slamming into a tree as the leader stumbled backward, his weapon clattering to the ground. The raptor seized the opportunity, its claws raking across the leader's arm as it let out a triumphant roar. The man stepped back, his chest heaving as he watched the poachers scatter, their morale shattered. The leader clutched his injured arm, his face pale as he barked at his men to retreat. Within moments, the poachers were gone, their shouts fading into the distance. The man collapsed to his knees, the branch slipping from his grasp as the adrenaline drained from his body. He looked up to see the younger raptor standing over him, its golden eyes filled with an intensity that took his breath away. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. The raptor chirped softly, its head tilting as it regarded him. Then, to his surprise, it stepped closer, its snout brushing against his shoulder in what felt like an unmistakable gesture of gratitude. The alpha appeared moments later, its scarred form emerging from the shadows. It let out a low growl, its golden eyes sweeping over the scene. The younger raptor stepped back, falling into place beside its leader. The man pushed himself to his feet, his body aching but his resolve stronger than ever. He watched as the pack began to retreat, their sleek forms disappearing into the forest one by one. The younger raptor lingered for a moment, its gaze locking onto his before it turned and followed the others. He stood there for a long time, the forest growing quiet around him once more. The supplies in his bag felt heavier than they should have, a reminder of what he had gained and what he had lost. He didn't know if he would ever see the raptors again, but he knew their bond would stay with him forever. With a deep breath, he turned toward the horizon, the faint outline of civilization visible in the distance. His journey wasn't over, but he was no longer the same man who had stumbled into the forest days ago. He had seen courage, loyalty, and compassion in the most unexpected of places, and he would carry that with him wherever he went. As he took his first step toward the future, he felt a strange sense of peace. The forest had changed him, and though he was leaving it behind, a part of him would always remain among the shadows, where man and raptor had stood side by side.